Hey guys, welcome back to Psalms to God. This is the journaling hour. We're on episode number 4, guys. Thank you for tuning in and for joining. This evening, we're going to actually talk about a couple of different women. Some of them I journaled off camera, and some of them I will be showing you my journal entries as I'm doing them. So I will put timestamps in the description for each woman so that Google, Google, YouTube will do its thing and show you where you can skip to, since it will be an hour-long video. That way, if you want to hear about a specific woman, you can jump straight to that timestamp. Before we jump into tonight's study, I do want to say a quick prayer, and then we'll get into it. So, Father, thank you for bringing us together and allowing us to study your word. I pray that as we study these different women of the Bible, it will open our eyes and our hearts to who you created us to be, that the examples that you have provided for us can help us to grow in our faith and in our presence and in all of the things that you have for us. I pray that we will learn from the good and the bad and not be like those who are bad. I pray that you will continue to grant us these opportunities, and that for those who may not have these opportunities, that you will still bless them and bring them the same knowledge through your Holy Spirit. In your Son, Jesus' name, amen. So the first woman that I studied off camera is Abi or Abby, which is a shortened form of the name Abijah, and she is referenced as both in the text. She is referenced first as Abi or Abby in Second Kings chapter 18, verse 2, and then she is referenced as Abijah in Second Chronicles chapter 29, verse 1. There's not a lot of information listed about this person. However, what is there is kind of interesting. First, I will say that I did do I guess, a mini word study on her name. When names are given, I do like to look up the meaning of the names because in Hebrew culture, they actually gave people names that were related to who they were. The names have meanings, and I think people were more aware of what the names meant as opposed to our society today, where we just sometimes we have names just because they're pretty or just because we were named after a family member. Of course, some of them were also named after family members, and we'll see that as we go through the studies as well. But in this case, the name Abi and Abijah is actually like a phrase, with Abi meaning my father and Yah being a shortened form of Yahweh. So it really means my father, or Yahweh is my father. And so that is a really beautiful name. And I think it's interesting because her son is one of the best kings Israel has, but her husband and her father are both described as wicked kings, and the only information we're given about her is that she is related to these men, which is really interesting because in this, we're seeing, I guess, a glimpse of her, and there really, I mean, from a general standpoint, there was no real need to tell us her name. Like, we know that, you know, there was a mother. Like, we didn't necessarily need to know who was the mother. I'm assuming part of this, like, call out of saying who she is the fact that her father was Zechariah, who was a king of the northern kingdom of Israel. For those who are a little rusty on Old Testament history, the kingdom of Israel split after Solomon. So while Solomon's son was reigning, this kingdom split, and you ended up with the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so you had the 10 tribes in the north and the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, plus the Levites in the south. And there was a bit of friction in between them, but this may have been an attempt to form an alliance or, to broker peace between the two kingdoms. It makes sense that Zechariah would have had his daughter marry Ahaz, who was the king in southern Judah. um, or in Judah, which was the southern kingdom. We aren't given a timeline, so it's hard to tell exactly what happened, and it's not explicitly said that that's what happened. But I imagine one of two things happened. So Zechariah is killed in a coup that happened a lot in the Northern Kingdom. Um, so what I would imagine happened is either while Zechariah was king, he had his daughter marry Ahaz to strengthen the relationship between the two kingdoms, or after he was killed, she fled into southern Israel to get away from northern Israel. And because she was technically, sort of a princess, it seems that she probably would have bumped heads with, not bumped heads, but, rubbed elbows with Ahaz. And because she was, demoted from princess down to basically a peasant, it makes sense that she would want to marry a king to reclaim that status of royalty, etc., etc. So that it's also possible that that's how they ended up married. Like I said, the Bible doesn't say. I put this under unknowns. These are things that we don't know. We can only speculate about. But it's interesting. The more interesting parts are that both Ahaz and Zechariah are described as wicked kings. So they're not good people. Um, but then her son, Hezekiah, is one of the best kings that Israel has. And he really brings the nation and the country back to God. So that made me wonder, like, where did he get that from? Did he get that from his mother? But like we're not really told about her mother or about her. It's unlikely she got that from her father because he was wicked, and we know she married a wicked man as a husband. But her father was also killed, and we're not told how old she was when her father was killed. Again, she could have been a young child, she could have been adult. I don't know, but I do know that whether you are a young child or an adult, having a parent killed is a very traumatic thing. And that act could have swung her towards the Lord. I should have done more studying while I was studying her to see how long he was king and how old he was when he died. I'm not sure. So the funny thing about genealogies in the Bible is there are a lot of things you can find if you just like take the time to like comb through them. And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. This is one of those cases where I didn't. And now that I'm looking back, I kind of wish I had, because I'm also wondering if Hezekiah ever met his grandfather. Because it's also possible that the death of his grandfather could have affected Hezekiah. And so maybe it wasn't necessarily the influence of his mother or his father that pushed him towards God, but seeing what happened to his father, to his grandfather, and what was happening to the people who rebelled against God that made him turn. I don't really know. Um, but yeah, so that's her. Very short snippet on her. The next person that I studied off camera is Abigail. There are actually two Abigails in the Bible. Abigail number one is the one that most people think of when you say Abigail. Her story is predominantly told in 1 Samuel chapter 25. She ends up married to King David. So there's other text later in Samuel, I think it's later in Samuel, maybe in Kings, that talks about some things that happen while David is on the run and she ends up getting taken hostage. So there is a large amount of information on Abigail, and we could have done a deep dive study on her just like we did on the wise woman of Abel. However, I already have a video up on the channel from the Breakfast and Bible series where I talked about Abigail, and I didn't really feel like I had anything new to add to that content. So instead of rehashing all of that, I'm just going to put that in the description box. And if you want to listen to that, you can go to that video to listen to information on Abigail. Either way, the information for my journal, the pages, and all of that will be linked on my website. I'm still working on launching a more like in-depth and interactive page on the website, but I also have up the kind of draft page that gives you the list of women to study. That will have the Bible verses and stuff like that in the meantime. So all of that information will be available to you guys. Um, so Abigail number 2 is also related to David. She is David's sister. She is listed in a genealogy with other sisters of David in First Chronicles chapter 2 verses 15 through 17. Um, Again, reading a little bit before and a little after will give you more context and see that this is a genealogy and that we're listing out the sons of Jesse, and then it says and their sisters, which helps you tie in how this relationship is formed. But she's also mentioned in Second Samuel chapter 17 verse 25. And what's interesting is that we get a couple of relational cues about this Abigail. We're told that she is the sister of David, that she's the mother of Amasa, and that she marries a man named Jether, who is an Ishmaelite. But where this gets really interesting is that in that last verse I mentioned, the Second Samuel chapter 17, verse 25, we're told that she's the daughter of Nahash. Now, this is where I thought it was interesting because this again goes back to what I mentioned in the previous episode about how sometimes we make assumptions, and if you stop and you think through your assumptions, they may not be valid. This is one of those cases where I'm not really sure which direction is the true direction here. Okay, so in First Chronicles chapter 2, when we meet Abigail, we're given a lineage of Jesse. We're talking about Jesse's sons, and then it says, and their sisters. To me, this implies that these are the daughters of Jesse, because we're talking about Jesse, we're in a lineage, we're talking about the lineage of Jesse. So it seems like this is a continuation of Jesse's progeny. But then that would mean that when we get to Second Samuel and it says that this is the daughter of Nahash, that Nahash should be her mother. And that means that Nahash should be a woman. However, Nahash doesn't actually appear, I think, on any of the lists that I saw of the lists of women, which confused me. And when I went to look up Nahash, most of the things said that it was a man. So then I was like, wait, I am confused. So I started trying to unravel a little bit of this. I don't think it matters in the context of who Abigail is, but it does matter in terms of whether or not I use Nahash in the anthology and whether or not she's a woman or not. Um, but I did a little bit of digging, and there are a couple of scenarios that could be going on here. So I wanted to mention those while we're talking about this before we move on to the next people, and to tell you that I'm probably going to include Nahash in the anthology just to talk about the ambiguity and whether or not this is a man or a woman. So, first and foremost, it very well could be a woman. This could be the mother of Abigail. But it could also still be a man and this not be a contradiction. And this is how. The Bible doesn't use the word grandfather or grandmother or grandson or granddaughter anywhere in the text. That doesn't exist. So in a lot of cases they will still say the father of or the son of or the daughter of for this phrase. So it would be just as accurate to say that, you know, Jacob is the son of Abraham, right? And you see that throughout the text where they call them the fathers or whatever, and they say the sons of, um and even in the naming of different communities by calling them Israelites, they're named after Israel or Jacob, right? And so it could be that Nahash is a ancestor of either Jesse or Abigail's mother, and this could be her grandfather or her great grandfather or someone like that. Now, while I was trying to work this out, I didn't get so deep into it where I actually like went looking to see if I could find Nahash and see if he is mentioned in like another passage where I could say, oh, okay, Nahash was the father of this person who's the father of that person that gets to Jesse. So this is her like great, great, great grandfather or something. I didn't think it was that important for the moment. But I will do that when we get to the ends and I actually study Nahash to try to see if this is her mother or some male ancestor that's being referenced. But again, this is one of the things about how it's very difficult to actually identify who is a female and who is a male in the text, because some of this we're just predispositioned to assume it's a man when we see the name, because we know that most of the people are men, and we've also been taught that the Bible is a patriarchal book, which it is, but there are some twists and turns that make you wonder. It's a lot more nuanced than I think people make it seem. And that's also part of why I'm doing this study and why I'm breaking down each and every woman I can find in the text, and why I gave the disclaimer in the first video that the list may not be complete and it may include people that some people say are not a woman, and it may include people that it may not include people that are women because I just totally missed them. So that is Abigail number 2. And the name Abigail, we talked about the prefix Abi meaning my father. Abigail means my father is joy. So the next couple of women we're going to talk about is Abihail. So not Abigail, Abihail with an H. There are 5 Abihails listed in the Old Testament. 5. 2 of them are definitely men. One of these men is described as the son of somebody, the other man is described as the uncle of someone. So those are men. 2 of them are definitely women. They are both described as the wife of someone. The 5th one, we're not given any gender indication of at all, which means there's a 50-50 shot that that is a woman. So I'm including them in here too. So Abihail number 1 is mentioned in First Chronicles chapter 2 verse 29. She is the wife of Abishag, and she has 2 sons, Aban, and Molid. She's listed in a genealogy, and that's all the information we get about her. Also, the name Abihail, again with this prefix of Abi, my father. My father is mighty in Hebrew. The second Abihail is mentioned in Second Chronicles chapter 11 verse 18. This is the wife of Rehoboam. Now we're back in the family tree of David. Rehoboam is David's grandson. So David has Solomon. Solomon has Rehoboam. Rehoboam becomes king after Solomon, and it is under his leadership that the kingdom splits in half. And this Abihail is wife number 2. Well, let me not say wife number 2, because she could have been his first wife. She is one of 2 of his wives. He only has 2. He learned, I guess, from Solomon that 1,000 wives is too many. And so he only took 2. She is one of those 2. And so that is one of the major things that we learn about her. But we also learn that she is the daughter of Eliab. Now, if you follow this up, Eliab is the firstborn son of Jesse. Jesse is David's father, which means Eliab is is David's brother, which means that Abihail is David's niece. So David's niece married David's grandson. They're related. Now, for anybody who immediately thought, wait a minute, there got to be a weird age difference here. I thought that for half a second, and then I thought about my own family. I literally have a cousin that is the same age as me, And her grandmother is my aunt, which is the same relationship you would have here, where like my father is right, my grandmother's niece, right? Like it's the same thing. Like you would be like, okay, I could see how this could line up, right? Because her grandmother, I'm her grandmother's niece, right? It's this literally the same relationship, except we're not crazy, right? We recognize that we're related, and that's weird. But back then, it wasn't as weird to them. It was only like I think siblings. I'm not sure if they included first cousins. I don't think they included first cousins, but that's a science lesson and that's a whole different conversation. We're not opening that can of worms. David's family still. All we know is that she is, like I said, the wife of Rehoboam. They have kids together, I assume, but I didn't find anything explicitly talking about their kids or their children. So that's all we know. Uh, Now on to the final Abihail. Abihail number, I'm calling her number 3 in this journal because I'm listing out the women. There's, of course, the other 2 that are definitely men. This Abihail is listed in Numbers chapter 3, verse 35. There's all we know is that this Abihail is the parent of a man named Zuriel, and Zuriel is the chief of a house in the tribe of Levi. It doesn't say that this is a man, it doesn't say that this is a woman. We have evidence of a 50-50 shot of this name being masculine versus feminine. So I included this person here. They could be a man, they could be a woman. I don't really know. But these are the people that I studied offline, um, and just kind of journaled through on my own. Now I will hop over under the camera and start journaling again. I wasn't All right, so now we're gonna flip to the journal and I will be journaling in real time. So we have 2 more women that we're going to study tonight. Again, there is no real rhyme or reason as to who I'm showing me journaling and who I'm not. I'm still working out the kinks and the timing and how long it takes me to journal versus how long it takes me to talk, etc., etc. Just bear with me, and as always, feel free to leave your suggestions and comments and preferences in the comment section, and I will take those into consideration as I start filming the next videos and things like that. But the first person we're going to talk about as I journal is the wife of Abiram. Like the last couple of people we've talked about, there's not a lot of details provided about this woman. In fact, she's not even really called out specifically as the wife of Abraham. She's lumped in as the wives of Abiram and another man who rebelled against Aaron and Moses during the Exodus. So this passage is in Numbers chapter 16. She is specifically mentioned in verse 27, or she and the other wives are mentioned in verse 27. And it's a really interesting passage for so many reasons. Even though there's not a lot of information here, again, this is one of those times where you could literally have an hour-long study just about her, just about this situation, and a lot of it will always just be speculation and question. So to catch you up for context, in number 16, we're getting the punishment of Abiram and his co-conspirators who have basically voiced complaints against Aaron and Moses. This group thought that they deserved the same amount of power and station and things like that. And so they basically kind of started like a coup of sorts against Moses and Aaron. God steps in and here where we see the mentioning of this woman or women, they're being punished and judged for conspiring against God's chosen people or God's chosen leadership. And so, really, all we know is that these men had wives and children. We don't know how many, like, it just says the wives of, these two men or three men who were in the rebellion. I don't know if each man had one wife or each man had multiple wives. So I put the wife of Abiram, but Abiram could have had multiple wives being discussed in this statement. It's not really clear. But also, it's not really clear why they're punished with their husbands. And I think this goes into like a much deeper question that as you read the Bible, as you really get into the text, these are the questions where what you're reading and how you may react to it are probably going to come into conflict. At least I should hope that you have to sit down and have a conversation with God about passages like this. And these are the types of passages that atheists or people who may have been brought up Christian and have left the faith, these are the passages they're going to go to because they don't necessarily make sense. And that's because there's so much information missing. So these men have rebelled against God's order and they're punished by being killed. God strikes them down. That in and of itself, you may have discussions about, but it makes sense. You are punished. You committed a crime and you're punished for your crime. But in passing, it mentions their wives and their children are also killed for their, in all of those with the rebellion. But we're never told about the wives or the children's part in the rebellion. Like, was Abiram's wife, like, leading the charge? Was she spreading propaganda? Was she telling, was she dropping seeds in other women's ear to spread to their husbands? Was she the one egging on Abiram, like, when they had conversations? We don't really know. And I think it's interesting because the way we're taught about the Bible and about women's roles in society in ancient times, we're taught as though they were just kind of like a fly on the wall, that they didn't talk, that they didn't, like, almost as though they would have no interaction at all. And in that regard, it makes it seem really evil that she would be killed too, because we're like, well, why was she punished, right? If Abiram was the one rebelling. But remember, there is a possibility that she was also involved in the rebellion. We just aren't told of her involvement. But then there's also the question of mercy. I know that's going to sound really weird, but hear me out. So a lot of how we read the Bible and how we view stories, it comes from our understanding of who God is. And this is something that I've been learning and trying to wrap my head around in terms of being able to explain to others, is that who you see God as, like the traits that you believe God has, it very much shapes how you read the text. And so if we believe that God is a just God, it's not just believing he's a just God, but like how you rank his traits. I don't know how to explain it. So there are people, like, that God has traits A, B, C, D, and E, and F, right? We know that God is a God of love. We know he's the God of mercy, but we know he's the God of judgment, and he's a God of wrath, and he's a God of justice. He's there for the poor, right? Like, most people, if you ask them, they will articulate, the same kind of list of traits of God, but often we prioritize them. So some people see him first and foremost as a God of love. And these are typically the people who are like, God is love. He loves everyone. And they may ignore like moments where he might be the God of wrath, where he may be the God of judgment. And similarly, you have people who will very much harp on the fact that he is a God of order and a God of judgment, and they will be like more legalistic, and they will miss out on the mercy and the love and the kindness, right? And so that shapes how you view the passages, because whatever trait you see predominating out of God is what comes into focus. And the one that I am thinking of now as I read this passage is that of justice. God is a God of justice and of mercy. And so if we believe that he is a just God, then there has to be a just cause for him punishing the women and the children in this instance. But then that leads me to the question of the word punishment. I'm using the word punishment because they died. And I think most of us would, and if you heard a sermon preached about this passage, they would say punishment. They were all punished. But is death always a punishment? And this is where things get a little bit more like difficult and a little more uncomfortable in terms of a conversation. So I want to explain this in a context first, and then we'll come back to Abiram and his wife. So recently I had a family member pass away, and they passed away after being sick for a long time. In fact, I had two family members that were down at the same time. And it was hard to watch them decline. They got progressively worse, and they were in pain, and they were basically just here. Like, they weren't having a good time. It wasn't like, they were living their best life and then they died. It was, I'm progressively getting sicker. I'm progressively in more and more pain, and every day is agony. But like, no one really wants to let go, type of a thing. And during this time, me and my parents had a conversation where my parents were talking about their wishes, and I was echoing essentially the same thing about my own wishes, that I don't want to die that way. Like, personally, I would like to be here 1 minute and gone the next. I don't care how that happens. I just don't want to suffer through death. Like, I don't want to be sitting here watching death walk up to me and just waiting to die. In some cases, there is a mercy in dying. We see this, for instance, with animals. When we talk about putting an animal to sleep, sometimes you have pets, horses are very common with this, dogs, where they're at the end of their life, they're suffering, there's nothing you can do for them, and so they put them to sleep, to put it nicely, and they're just put out of their pain. When we look at life, sometimes the more humane thing is to let someone die, even though that sounds sad, and even though it's hard. But again, this comes back into belief in what do we think happens when we die, right? If you think that that's just the end, then that's really tragic. If you're talking about somebody who's not saved and you think that they're going to hell, that's also tragic, right? Because you no longer have any time to repent. You no longer have any time to get right. But if you think of someone with a blank slate, someone who is saved, someone who is going to be with God, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. And in here would be all of the conversations about, for instance, children and people who die before the age of accountability. And that's a whole nother can of worms. But the point that I want to get to is that if Abiram's wife was completely innocent, she didn't have anything to do with this rebellion, but yet she ended up dead because of her husband, the question I have is, was this God's was this a form of mercy and justice in the sense that many times during this era, widows were the bottom of society, right? We see this a little bit in the story of Ruth, where Ruth and Naomi are struggling, and Ruth is working the fields of Boaz because they don't have any food, they don't have any money. So if you have a rebellion and you have a lot of men who are participating in this rebellion, and the men are punished and they're killed, but they leave behind all of these wives, and there's no one to marry the wives, there's no one to take care of the wives or the children, what becomes of them, right? I mean, imagine, I mean, this is not exactly the case, but like imagine if, you know, it's you and your family, you and your husband and your child, and you're the only people left, and your husband dies and it's just you and your child by yourself, or you and your husband die and then your child is left alone. Who is going to take care of your child? And so it makes me wonder if there's some layer of mercy and justice that God was trying to balance out by saying, like, okay, I'm not going to leave you to suffer with what's left behind in the aftermath, and I'm just going to go ahead and take you, right? And then we see those people in the kingdom after judgment, right? I don't know. Now, again, like I said, she could have had a part in the rebellion and it could have been a punishment. I don't really know, but these are the kinds of things I think that come up when you study and when you get deep into the word. And like I said, we could have a whole hour conversation about that and just diving in on like why this story is even present in the Bible. But there's actually not a lot of information there, and anything we come up with is entirely speculation. It's entirely what we're given by the Holy Spirit or what we've made up based on our own convictions and our own thoughts. And that's what makes faith hard. That's what makes the Bible hard. That's what makes life hard. So again, when you're studying and as you're digging in, you know, spend as much time or as little time, depending on you, but even for some of these women that are mentioned in passing, there can be a lot of philosophical, theological, and deeply perplexing questions that come up. And that's, again, like I said, one of the hard things for me in figuring out who I'm going to talk about on in the episodes, who I'm going to show you me journaling and what I'm going to write and not write, how deep we get into it. Lots of places that things can go. But that is all I think I'm going to say about the wife of Abiram, again, told in Numbers chapter 16. So now we're going to start talking about a woman named Abishag or Abishag. And as I was journaling this, I definitely messed up. I forgot the A and wrote the G. And I sat there and debated on whether I wanted to just leave it like that or whether I wanted to try to fix it. And you will see, I'm going to go in and turn that into a sort of an A. It's not going to look like the first A, but it will be an A. And then I'm going to white out the little tail of the G, and then redraw the G to try to make it at least somewhat right. I was like, this one is just too much. I can't do it. I do think I used whiteout first, or like a paint pen to try to white it out, and that didn't work. So eventually I ended up using the actual whiteout tape to cover up this mistake. But like I always said, guys, mistakes happen. It's okay. Just roll with it as you go. Abishag is talked about in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. This is another interesting story, and we are back in the family tree of David. David's family tree is so extensive. I don't think I realized that, or maybe they just all have names that start with A. I don't know. I just feel like every other woman is connected to David somehow. But Abishag's story is, again, another one of those really interesting and weird stories. So when David gets old, they decide that they need to find a young virgin woman to nurse the king and keep him warm in his old age. And so they go out and they find Abishag, who is described as a beautiful Shunammite woman, and it's explicitly told to us that although that she is gone, they go and they find her and bring her to nurse and warm the king. She does not have sex with David. That's told explicitly in the text. She didn't sleep with him. And in the aftermath, after David dies, one of David's sons, named Adonijah, who has also tried to take the throne, then turns around and asks Solomon, one of David's other sons, if he can have Abishag as a wife. And Solomon is very, very upset about this request, and Solomon basically has him killed after he makes this request. So that is what we are told about Abishag. And again, like I said, this is a really weird and interesting story. There's so many different things within this that make me question what's happening. So first and foremost, right, when we talk about marriage and marrying someone, like if you think about like an Abraham and Sarah, they grow old together, and we don't see like Sarah go out and find someone else to take care of Abraham when Abraham gets old, right? Now there is the whole thing with Hagar and having a baby, but for the most part, it just seems like they grow old together. And that's what we generally expect. Like if you get married, you assume that you're going to get old and, you know, he's going to get old. And I mean, yeah, you may have to end up in like a nursing home, or you may have hospice or something like that if someone gets particularly sick. But this idea that you have to hire someone to take care of your husband, like David had multiple wives, not just one wife, but multiple wives. And it wasn't suggested that his wives take care of him in his old age. I think that's really, really interesting, particularly in the context that the church usually talks about the role of being a wife. Another thing that's interesting is that they're very specific. They're not just going out and finding a nurse. It's not like, oh, let's go find the most qualified woman who can take care of David. But they're looking for a specific type of woman. They want a young woman. They want a virgin woman. And so there is an implication that this woman was entertaining him in a way that was more than just a nurse, right? And then they make the call out that she did not have sex with David. So it seems like this was a marriage, but an unconsummated marriage. That's really the vibe that I got reading it, because it just, like, if she wasn't being brought in for that purpose, why would she need to be a virgin? Why does she need to be young? Why does she need to be beautiful? None of these things matter in terms of just taking care of someone. But then it talks about keeping him warm, which implies that she must have been like laying in the bed with him, which would have been highly inappropriate for a married woman, right? But again, like, why couldn't it have been a widow, right? Like Abigail, that would have been perfectly, I guess, acceptable. I don't know. But there's something, right? There was a reason that they went and found a young, virgin, beautiful woman to fulfill this role. But they're telling us that she did not sleep with David. So there is some level of like abstinence, or, it not being for that reason, etc., etc. But then we're told that one of his sons wants to take her as a wife. And so like this comes into some of the more interesting things, because Solomon is upset and doesn't allow this request. And I think that has a lot more to do with the politics of this other brother trying to take the throne from Solomon than just with Abishag and her being married. But the fact that she was put in this position, even though if she was a virgin before and we're told she didn't have sex with David, she's a virgin after, she would still technically be, a candidate for marriage in the same sense as the other young women, but she probably was seen as the wife of David. And so, in a certain sense, she would have been seen as a widow when David died, maybe. I'm not 100% sure. The text doesn't really tell us. But it made me wonder, like, after the death of David, did she get remarried? Like, did Solomon stop everyone who wanted to marry her? Or was it just that one brother? And, like, if she did get married, did she go on and have a family and have kids? Or was she stuck as, like, basically like an unofficial widow / concubine of David for the rest of her life? Was that just, like, the end of her life? That's, that was one of the questions that came up. And again, I was like, why didn't his wives act as the nurse? Was this their idea? Like, did they resent her? Or were they like, yep, I'm glad she's here to deal with him and his foolishness and his old age, so I don't have to deal with it, right? Like, it really makes me wonder what was going on. And again, when we talk about someone like David, like, a lot of times we get fixated on David being a man after God's own heart, but David did wrong things too. David had a ton of wives, not as many as Solomon, but he did have more than one or two, and God did tell them not to have a ton of wives as kings. So David was in the wrong there. And we know that he committed adultery with Bathsheba. Then he tried to have Bathsheba's husband killed. He did have him killed. So we know that David was not a perfect man. So even this scenario of Abishag coming and being this whatever she was for him, it doesn't mean that this was a good thing, right? The fact that this story is here doesn't mean that this is how things were supposed to be or that this is how things should have happened. And I think, again, when we study the word, these are the types of conversations that I think get left out particularly when we talk about women of the Bible. Just because the wives didn't take care of David and this woman took care of him instead doesn't mean that it's not the responsibility of spouses, wives and husbands, to take care of each other as they get older. I don't think there was an explicit condemnation of what David did in the text, but it also doesn't mean that God was pleased with this situation. We don't really know. It's just something that happened and it's recorded. And I don't even know if it's recorded because we're supposed to know that David had this young, beautiful nurse in his last days, or if we're just told this backstory about her to see why Solomon is upset that his brother is asking for her hand in marriage, because this is part of the political intrigue and the political turmoil that's happening within Israel. So from a historical standpoint, she could just be kind of like a footnote to tell us why this tension existed between Solomon and Adonijah. That being said, I did write out a couple of traits that I think that would be associated with her. Of course, she is explicitly called out as being young, beautiful, and a virgin. And so she was probably pretty innocent and pretty young. But she must have also been very humble and serving, because she is serving the king. He's old, he's sick. I don't know if you've ever had to deal with old, sick people, and in particular men, because men tend to be a little bit more stubborn. David was, we don't know what all she had to put up with, but taking care of people when they're getting in years and getting older is very difficult. There's tons and tons of articles and conversations about what caregivers go through and the support that they need during and after the time that they're doing this. And so she was in fact a caregiver. And there's a lot of nurturing and humility and patience and other such traits that she would have had to have to succeed in that role. And I think those are important to call out because those are all positive traits. Even if this situation is weird and maybe not something we should ever be in, those traits that she would have exhibited are definitely positive things to dwell on and to remember. As always, I did a name study. Her name is Abishag. It also has this Abi or Abby, which means my father, in it. And so her name actually means my father is a wanderer, which is interesting. That doesn't really sound like a description of the Most High, whereas, the names that meant like my name is, my God is mighty or something like that. Those definitely sound like they're a definition of the Father, though you could arguably be talking about a human. This definitely sounds like a human father. My father is a wanderer, but we're not told anything about her father. We are told that she's a Shunammite, which I do want to go back to the fact that she is a Shunammite. There are actually a couple of Shunammite women discussed in the text. You have a Shunammite woman who receives a miracle from Elijah. We'll talk about her later. And then you also have the woman of Song of Solomon, who is also a Shunammite. And that is triggering a thought in my head right now because there is a woman, the woman who is talking in Song of Solomon is also a Shunammite woman. And I am actually wondering if that is Abishag. Like, what if Solomon took Abishag as his own wife after Adonijah suggested that she be his wife? She is also a Shunammite. She was young. Maybe that might be a thing. I don't know. Again, like I said, that is not explicitly said anywhere. It's just something that popped into my head literally as I was calling out her ancestry to talk about the fact that we don't know much about her, except that she was a Shunammite, and we're not given any details of her lineage or anything like that. But it's an interesting theory. Yeah. So that's really all I have about Abishag, but I do end up continuing to journal this on the next page. So I'm just going to speed up the footage here as I finish out this journal entry. But for those who are new to this series, in the description box, there is a link. That link goes to a page where I have listed out all of the women that I have studied and will be studying. So you can follow along if you would like to replicate this. I also have detailed information about what pens that I'm using that will also be in the description box and in that link if you want to recreate anything that you see. Thank you for tuning in. This series will continue next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope to see you there. Have a good week.